I walked into the Kroger on Elm Street the same way I had every Tuesday for the past 31 years. I grabbed a cart near the entrance, the one with the slightly wobbly left wheel that I always managed to pick somehow, and I headed straight for the produce section. Bananas first. That was my routine. That was the routine I had kept even after my husband of 42 years was lowered into the ground at Riverside Memorial Cemetery on a cold Thursday morning in October. His name was Gerald. Gerald Wayne Oakes, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I loved that man. Completely. Foolishly, maybe. But completely. He had passed from what the doctors called a sudden cardiac event. That was how they said it. A sudden cardiac event. As if his heart had simply decided without warning, without giving me any chance to prepare, that it was finished. He was 68 years old. We had plans. We were going to drive down to Savannah in the spring. He wanted to see the magnolias blooming. I had already booked the bed and breakfast. For 8 months after the funeral, I did what widows do. I thanked people for their casseroles. I sorted through his clothes and donated most of them to the church. I kept his cardigan, the brown one with the small hole near the left pocket, because it still smelled faintly like him. I went to grief counseling every other Wednesday at the community center. I cried in the car afterward, then drove home and made myself a proper dinner, because my daughter kept telling me I was getting too thin. I thought I was healing. That is the word people use. Healing. Like grief is a wound that closes over time if you just keep it clean. It was the second Tuesday in June, when everything I believed about my life turned out to be a lie. I remember I was reaching for the bananas. I wanted ones that were still slightly green, because Gerald always said the yellow ones went soft too fast. And even in his absence, that habit had stayed with me. I picked up a bunch, checked the stems, set them in the cart, and then I looked up. He was standing at the end of the produce aisle, tall with that particular way he had of holding his shoulders, slightly rounded, like he was always about to lean in and tell you something quietly. Gray hair at the temples. He was wearing a blue plaid shirt. Gerald had a blue plaid shirt. He had 3 of them because I used to buy him one every Christmas because he always said it was the perfect shirt, and I never knew what else to get a man who wanted nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. Grief does that. My counselor had warned me. She said I might see him in crowds, in strangers, in the particular way someone tilts their head. She said it was normal. She said the mind searches for what it has lost. But then he turned, and it was his face. Not a resemblance, not a trick of the light. It was Gerald's face. The slight asymmetry of his nose from where he broke it playing baseball at 17. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a fishing hook accident in 1998. The way his left eye crinkled just slightly more than the right when he squinted. I let go of the cart. I don't remember doing it, but I became aware that my hands were empty and the cart had drifted sideways, and an older gentleman nearby was asking me if I was all right. I couldn't answer him. I was watching Gerald walk toward the dairy section. He had a basket on his arm, a red plastic basket. He was buying groceries. He was alive and he was buying groceries, and I had stood at his grave in the rain and watched them put him in the ground. I followed him. I am not proud of how I did it. I stayed several steps back, pretending to look at things on the shelves, picking up items I didn't need. A jar of pickles, a box of crackers. My heart was knocking so hard against my chest I could feel it in my ears. He moved to the store with no urgency. He checked his phone once. He paused to look at the yogurt. He selected a specific brand, the low-fat vanilla, and I nearly made a sound because that was Gerald's brand. He had eaten that yogurt every single morning for 15 years. He paid with cash. I watched from 2 registers over, pretending to read the label on the crackers I was holding. He said something to the cashier and she laughed. Then he picked up his bag and walked out. I abandoned my cart. I left everything in it and followed him into the parking lot. He got into a silver Camry. I had driven a gray Camry for years before Gerald convinced me to switch to the Honda. He pulled out of the space and I watched him turn left out of the parking lot onto Birchwood Avenue. I stood there in the sun with my purse strap slipping off my shoulder until he was completely out of sight. Then I sat down on the curb like a child and I said out loud to nobody, "What is happening to me?" I went home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I tried to construct a rational explanation. a twin he had never mentioned, a cousin who bore a remarkable resemblance, a grief-induced hallucination so vivid and complete that it had included the scar above his eye and the specific brand of yogurt he had eaten since before we were married. None of it held. I called my son. His name is Philip, and he is 40 years old, and he has his father's same rounded shoulders, and when he answered the phone he sounded distracted the way he always sounds when he is at work. I told him what I had seen. There was a pause on his end. There was a pause on his end. A pause that lasted just slightly too long. "Mom," he said, "you've been under a lot of stress." "Philip, I know what your father looks like. Grief can. I know what your father looks like," I said again. "I was married to him for 42 years. He told me to get some rest. He said he would check on me over the weekend." He said it gently, the way you speak to someone you're concerned about. And I heard something in his voice that I could not identify then, something underneath the gentleness that I would understand much later. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the bed that still felt too large, and I stared at the ceiling, and I made a decision. I was going to go back to that Kroger the following Tuesday. Same time. Gerald had always been a creature of routine, just like me. If he had been there once, he would be there again. The following Tuesday I was in position by 9 in the morning. I had gotten there before the store was even fully busy. I told myself I would stay 2 hours. I walked the aisle slowly. I bought things I needed. I bought things I didn't need. I bought things I didn't need. At 9:47, he walked in. This time I was calmer. This time I followed him more carefully, and I did something I had not done the first time. When he went to the yogurt section, I positioned myself close enough to hear him. He said something under his breath to himself, a small private commentary on the prices. It was something Gerald would say, the exact words Gerald would say. And then his phone rang. He answered it. He said, "Yeah, I'm just about finished here." He listened. He said, "All right, sweetheart." He said it softly, the way he used to say it to me. I stepped back behind the display of granola bars and I pressed my hand over my mouth. When he left the store this time, I followed him in my car. I want to say I am not the kind of woman who does things like that, but I was 64 years old and I had watched my husband go into the ground and he was standing in the grocery store buying vanilla yogurt and calling someone sweetheart on the phone. So I followed him. He drove 12 minutes from the Kroger. He turned into a neighborhood I did not know well, on the east side of town, the newer development that had gone in about 10 years ago. He pulled into the driveway of a house on Larkspur Drive. It was a tan house with white shutters and a small garden along the front walk with marigolds and purple salvia. Wind chimes hung near the front door. Copper ones. Gerald had always said he found wind chimes peaceful. I parked at the end of the street. He got out of the car with his groceries. He did not knock at the door. He used a key. I sat in my car for a long time. Long enough that the engine cooled and ticked quietly. Long enough that a neighbor walking a dog glanced at me twice. I was trying to understand what I was seeing and what it meant and what I was supposed to do with it. My husband had a key to a house I had never seen before in a neighborhood I had never been to. With wind chimes he would have liked and marigolds in the front garden. I drove home. I went to the kitchen. I sat down. And then I called my daughter. Her name is Renee, and she is 37 and she has always been the more direct of my two children. When I told her what I had found, she did not tell me I was stressed. She said, "Give me the address." I gave it to her. There was the sound of her typing. She said, "Mom, I'm going to look a few things up and call you back." She called back in 40 minutes. "That house," she said carefully, "is registered to a Gerald W. Oakes." I heard the words. I heard each one individually and separately, and then I heard them together, and I still could not make them mean what they meant. "The property records," Renee said, "show it was purchased 9 years ago." 9 years ago. We had still been married. We had been entirely, completely, as far as I knew, happily married 9 years ago. We had gone to our nephew's wedding in Charleston 9 years ago. We had repainted the kitchen 9 years ago. Gerald had bought a house 9 years ago and put it in his own name and told me nothing. "Mum," Renee said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." I went to the house on Larkspur Drive at 10 o'clock the following morning. I did not tell Philip. I told Renee only that I was going to get some answers, and she made me promise to call her the moment I was done. I rang the bell. There was a long pause, and then the door opened. He looked at me the way you look at something that cannot be there. His face went entirely white, and I knew in that moment, with the certainty that settled in my chest like cold water, that he was not a twin. He was not a look-alike. He was not a grief hallucination. He was Gerald Wayne Oakes, my husband of 42 years, standing in the doorway of a house I did not know existed, very much alive. "Vivian," he said. "My name." He said my name. "You're going to want to step outside," I said, "and you're going to want to explain everything to me right now." He did not step outside, he stepped back. And then a woman appeared behind him in the hallway. She was perhaps 55, with dark hair going silver, and an expression that shifted rapidly from curiosity to alarm. She looked at me. She looked at Gerald. She said, "Who is this?" Gerald said nothing. I said, "I am his wife, of 42 years, and I buried him 8 months ago." The woman's face changed in a way I will not forget for the rest of my life. It collapsed inward, the way a face does when the architecture it was built on suddenly gives way. She looked at Gerald. She looked at me. She said his name, not Gerald, but a different name, and that told me everything about how thoroughly he had built this other life, so completely that he had even given himself a different name inside of it. I will not tell you I handled this with dignity. I will tell you I said several things I had never said out loud before in my life. I will tell you that the woman, whose name I later learned was Sandra, sat down very suddenly on the bench in her own hallway and put her head in her hands. I will tell you that Gerald tried twice to speak, and twice I cut him off because there was nothing he could say that I wanted to hear in that moment. What I wanted was answers. What I wanted was the truth. So I asked him directly. I said, "Did you fake your own death?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It was a heart event. It was real. I had a real episode." "But it didn't." He stopped. He tried again. "The doctors said I had survived. There was a window at the hospital where the paperwork." "Gerald," I said, "did you choose to let me believe you were dead?" He looked at his shoes. He was 68 years old. He had lived 42 years of his life with me and 9 years of a second life in this house with this woman and whatever name he had given himself here. And he looked at his shoes. "Yes," he said. "I called Renee from the driveway." My hands were not entirely steady. She answered on the first ring. "I told her he was alive. I told her he was standing in a house on Larkspur Drive with another woman and a different name, and that he had chosen, deliberately chosen, to let me bury an empty understanding of him. The cardiac event had been real. The death had been a choice. Then I called Philip. He answered on the third ring, and before I'd said more than 2 sentences, something happened in his voice. Something that was not surprise. I stopped mid-sentence. "Philip," I said, "did you know?" The silence was its own answer. He had known for 2 years. Gerald had called him. Gerald had told him that he had survived something, that he needed to start over, that he was asking Philip to keep the secret. Philip had kept it. He had sat across from me at Thanksgiving. He had held my arm at the gravesite. He had said, "Dad would have been so proud of you, Mom," at my granddaughter's recital last spring, and all of that time he had known his father was 12 minutes away buying vanilla yogurt on Tuesday mornings. I did not say anything to Philip that I will repeat here. What I will say is that I ended the call. And I sat in my car on Larkspur Drive, and I looked at the marigolds in the front garden and the copper wind chimes that were moving slightly in the morning breeze, and I understood that I had been grieving a man who was not dead. I had been alone in a house that felt too large and crying in parking lots after grief counseling, and eating too little and lying awake and missing him with everything I had. I had worn black to a funeral for a man who was alive 12 minutes away. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what I felt in that car is something I have words for. I'm not sure there are words. There is grief, and there is anger, and there is betrayal. But what I felt in that car was something past all 3 of those things. Something in a category that had no name I knew. What I will tell you is what I did next. I hired an attorney. Her name is not important, but she came highly recommended, and she had the kind of calm, focused manner that I needed very badly in that period. What Gerald had done was not simply a personal betrayal. It had legal dimensions. He had allowed me to file a death certificate. He had allowed estate proceedings to move forward on the basis of his supposed death. He had continued to receive income from a pension that had, upon his presumed death, shifted its structure in ways that had cost me significantly. He had lived in a property purchased jointly with marital funds and titled in his name alone. He had created a situation, my attorney said with a particular expression on her face, that was going to require considerable untangling. The untangling took 14 months. I will not walk you through all of it, because some of it is still difficult to think about clearly and some of it involved legal proceedings that are not mine alone to describe. What I will tell you is that the courts did not find Gerald's situation amusing. What I will tell you is that the house on Larkspur Drive was determined to be a marital asset. What I will tell you is that 42 years of marriage carry significant legal weight, even when one party has apparently decided that they are finished with it. Sandra, I learned later, had not known he was married. She had believed the story he had given her. She was, in her own way, another person he had deceived. I did not feel warmly toward her, not at first, but I did not feel the hostility toward her that I might have felt if I had believed she had known. She had been lied to as completely as I had, simply in a different direction. Philip and I did not speak for 4 months. He called on my birthday in November and left a message. I listened to it several times without returning the call. His wife, my daughter-in-law, sent a card that said she was sorry and that she had not known, which I believed because I know her. Eventually, Philip and I had a conversation that was long and painful and did not resolve everything between us, but it opened a door that had been sealed shut. We are still walking through that door. It is slow going. Renee called me every single day through all of it, every day. Sometimes she just called to tell me what she had for lunch or to complain about her commute. She was making sure I knew there was someone on the other end of the line. I did not tell her enough times how much that meant to me. I am telling it here. I moved. I had lived in that house for 27 years, and it held too much of a person who had decided he was done with his life there, and I found I could not stay in the rooms we had painted together and sleep in the bed that was too large. I bought a smaller house, a yellow one, in a neighborhood I had always liked, closer to Renee. I have a porch now. I sit on it in the mornings with my coffee, and I watch the street come alive, and I think about what it means to start something at 64. I went back to painting. I had painted watercolors in my 20s and 30s, and had stopped when the children were small and simply never picked it back up. I signed up for a class at the Community Arts Center, and the instructor, a cheerful man in his 40s, told me after 3 sessions that I had a real feel for color. I don't know if that is true or if he says it to everyone, but I bought new brushes. Good ones. And I paint on Saturday mornings at the kitchen table with the window open and the coffee next to me, and I think that this hour, right here, is mine in a way that very few hours of my life have ever been. I am not going to tell you I have forgiven Gerald. Forgiveness is a complicated thing, and I am not sure it is always owed, and I am not sure I am required to sort it out on anyone else's timeline. What I will tell you is that I have separated what I feel about him from what I feel about myself, and that separation took work, real work. The kind you have to do on purpose every single day. Because for a long time I felt foolish. For a long time I felt that 42 years of devotion made me look foolish in hindsight. I had to learn, slowly, that it did not. That loving someone completely is not foolishness. That being deceived is not the same as being a fool. That what he chose to do reflects entirely on him, and not one fraction of it belongs to me. My counselor said something to me once that I've thought about many times since. She said that sometimes the grief we think we are carrying is not grief for the person we lost, but for the story we believed we were living. And she was right about that. I grieved Gerald before I knew he was alive. But what I grieved was not the real Gerald. It was the story, the 42-year marriage to a man who was honest with me, the shared life that I believed was shared. That story was the thing that died. And it died the moment I looked up over the bananas and saw him standing at the end of the produce aisle. But here is what I know now. Here's the thing I want to say most clearly before I finish. I am not the woman standing in the parking lot anymore, watching a silver Camry turn left and not knowing what to do. I am the woman on the yellow porch with the good coffee and the watercolors and the daughter who calls every day. I am 65 years old, and I have started over in ways I would not have chosen, but which have given me something I did not know I was missing, which is a life that is entirely, completely, without question, my own. I love you. I used to tell Gerald at the end of every night for 42 years. I said it like a closing of accounts, like a door being shut gently. Now I wake up in my yellow house and I say it to the morning, to the porch, to the open window, to the brushes and the coffee and the sound of the street outside, to whatever this new chapter is that I did not plan for and would not have asked for, and which is nevertheless mine. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is, it turns out, exactly enough. I have thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened, not in any grand philosophical way, just quietly at the kitchen table or on the porch in the morning when it is still cool enough to sit outside with a second cup of coffee. I think about the choices Gerald made and where each one led him. I think about the choices Philip made and what they cost both of us. And I think about my own choices, the smaller ones, the ones I made without knowing they were choices at all. Gerald chose to build a second life rather than end the first one, honestly. That choice required another choice, and then another, each one a little larger than the last, until the whole structure required a death to hold it up. He did not plan for the fact that a lie of that size has weight, that it presses down on everything around it, that it presses down on the people who know and say nothing, the way it pressed down on Philip for 2 years, changing him in ways I am still learning to understand. Gerald thought he was solving a problem. What he was actually doing was creating a debt that eventually came due in a courtroom, in a property settlement, in a relationship with his son that I do not think will ever be fully repaired. Philip chose to protect his father over his mother. I understand the pressure he was under. I do not excuse it, but I understand it. What I want him to understand, and what I think he is slowly beginning to, is that protecting someone from the consequences of what they have done is not loyalty. It is participation. He carried that secret for 2 years, and it changed him. I could hear it in his voice on that first phone call, that slight flatness, that careful distance. Secrets like that have a cost, and Philip paid it whether he knew he was paying or not. Renee chose differently. She did not have information Philip had, but when I needed someone to stand beside me without hesitation, she did not ask whether it was convenient. She just stood there, and I have watched that steadiness pay forward in her own life in ways that have nothing to do with me, in the trust her colleagues place in her, in the way her children look at her, in the kind of person she is becoming. There is something to be said for the practice of showing up. It builds something in you over time that cannot be faked or bought. And then there is what I chose. I chose not to accept a version of events that did not match what I had seen with my own eyes, even when it would have been easier and more comfortable to call it grief and let it go. That choice was hard, following a man across a parking lot, and then across town, and then to a door you have never knocked on is not a graceful thing to do. It is frightening and uncertain, and you feel slightly ridiculous the entire time. But I have learned that the truth does not always arrive cleanly. Sometimes you have to go after it in a slightly wobbly cart on a Tuesday morning in the produce section. What I know now, that I did not know before, is that starting over is not a failure. It is not a consolation prize. At 64, I planted myself in a yellow house and picked up brushes I had set down 30 years ago, and I am making something. Not the life I planned. Something different. Something that is, in certain quiet and unexpected ways, more mine than anything I have lived before. That is the thing about being pushed to the very edge of what you thought you could endure. You find out what you are made of. Not in some dramatic revelation. Just slowly. Tuesday by Tuesday. Cup of coffee by cup of coffee. Brushstroke by brushstroke. You find out that you are still here, and that turns out to be enough to build on.